Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. My name is Leo, and this happened about 6 years ago. I was 22, trying to save up some money to go back to college. And I took what I thought would be the easiest job in the world. A night watchman at a demolition site. But it wasn't just any site. It was the old St. Dymphna's psychiatric hospital. Most of it had already been torn down, reduced to rubble and rebar skeletons. My job was to watch over the last remaining structure, the West Wing, which was slated for asbestos abatement before it came down too. The company gave me a small, heated trailer with a bank of grainy monitors, a coffee machine that tasted like burnt plastic, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The rules were simple: patrol the perimeter of the wing once an hour, every hour, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Don't go inside unless there's a clear sign of a break-in. And if that happens, don't play hero, just call the cops. Easy enough. For the first week, it was exactly that. Boring. The only company I had was the wind whistling through the broken panes of the upper floors, and the occasional raccoon digging through the dumpsters. The West Wing was a 3-story brick monstrosity, a relic from a time when mental health was treated with locked doors and cold, tiled rooms. During the day, I'd sometimes walk around it and peek through the boarded-up windows. I could see overturned gurneys, dusty medical equipment, and files scattered across the floors like dead leaves. It was creepy in a sad, historical way, but it wasn't scary. It was just an empty building, a dead place. The trouble started on a Tuesday, about 2 weeks into the job. It was just after my 2 a.m. patrol. I came back to the trailer, poured my third cup of sludge, and sat down in front of the monitors. The cameras were old, black and white, and mostly pointed at the chain-link fence, but one was aimed at the main entrance of the West Wing, a set of heavy, padlocked steel doors. As I was watching, one of the lights on the camera feeds flickered. It was the one pointed at the east side of the building, the part deepest in shadow. The light on the console blinked red for a second, then went green again. A power surge, I figured. The wiring out here was ancient. I didn't think much of it until my 3 a.m. patrol. I walked the perimeter, my flashlight beam cutting a clean cone through the darkness. Everything was quiet. The padlock on the main doors was secure. The boards on the windows were all in place. But when I got to the east side of the wing, I felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. It was a cold night, but this was different. This was a damp, cellar-like cold that clung to you. I swept my light across the wall and stopped. One of the ground floor windows, one I knew for a fact had been boarded up tight, now had a single plank pried loose, hanging by a nail. My heart started thumping against my ribs. Protocol said call the cops, but my brain said it was probably just some kids, urban explorers. If I called the police for a loose board, I'd look like an idiot. The foreman would probably chew me out in the morning. So, I decided to just take a quick look. It was a stupid decision. I squeezed my flashlight through the gap and pointed it inside. The beam landed on a floor covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. It looked like a waiting room, with chairs bolted to the floor in neat rows. Nothing seemed out of place. No fresh footprints, no beer cans. Just old, forgotten decay. I told myself the nail must have just rusted through and the board fell on its own. I made a mental note to tell the day crew and continued my patrol, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was now crawling up my spine. Back in the trailer, I couldn't sit still. I kept my eyes glued to the monitors. Around 4:30 a.m., it happened again. The light for the east side camera flickered, but this time it stayed red for a full 5 seconds. And in those 5 seconds, the screen went from a static, empty shot of the fence line to pure, fizzing static. When the image came back, everything looked the same. But I knew it wasn't a power surge. It felt like something had deliberately blocked the signal. The next night, I was on edge from the moment my shift started. I kept telling myself I was just spooked by an old building, but my gut was screaming at me. At my midnight patrol, I found another board pried loose on a different window, this time on the second floor. There was no way that was an accident. Someone was getting in. Someone who was strong enough and quiet enough to do it without making a sound. This time I called my supervisor, a guy named Frank. I told him what I found. He sighed, a long, tired sound over the phone. He told me it was probably copper thieves, and that he'd send a crew to resecure the building in the morning. He told me to stick to the perimeter and not to engage anyone. His lack of concern somehow made me feel even more nervous. It felt like I was the only one who understood that something was deeply wrong out here. The real terror began the following week. I'd started doing my patrols with my phone out, recording video just in case. It was a foggy, moonless night. The air was so thick and wet you could almost taste it. I was doing my fun AM walk when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound coming from inside the west wing. Scrape, drag, scrape, drag. I froze, standing dead still in the mud, straining to hear. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across a tile floor. My blood ran cold. It wasn't kids. It wasn't copper thieves. This was something else. I backed away slowly, my hand shaking so bad I could barely hold my flashlight steady. I got back to the trailer, locked the door, and stared at the monitors, my heart hammering like a drum solo. I didn't see anything. The building just sat there dark and silent. But I knew what I'd heard. I started to get obsessed. I spent my days at home reading about St. Dymphna's. I found old articles online. It was closed down in the late 80s after a massive scandal involving patient abuse and neglect. One article mentioned a long-term patient, a man who had been admitted as a child in the 50s and had spent over 30 years there. His name was Joseph. The article said he was lost in the system after the closure. There was no record of him being transferred anywhere. He just vanished. That night, I felt like I was being watched. The feeling was so intense it was almost physical, like a hand resting on the back of my neck. I stayed in the trailer, too scared to do my patrols. I just watched the screens. Around 3:15 a.m., the light on one of the cameras went out again. This time, it was the one pointed at the main doors. It was out for almost a minute. When it came back on, there was something new in the frame. Lying on the top step, right in front of the padlocked doors, was a dead bird, a crow. Its neck was twisted at an impossible angle. I felt sick. This was a message, a warning. I finally called the police. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. They were professional, but I could tell they thought I was a paranoid kid. They swept the perimeter with their powerful flashlights, noted the dead bird, and found another loose board on a 3rd-floor window. They did a quick, cursory check inside the ground floor, declared it clear, and told me to call them if I saw an actual person. Before they left, one of them said, "Kid, a place this old plays tricks on your mind. Don't let it get to you." But it wasn't a trick. The next night, I found a page from an old patient file taped to the inside of my trailer door. It was brittle and yellowed, with typewritten text. The name on the top was Joseph M. The page was a log of his treatments. It was horrifying. Ice baths, electroshock therapy, solitary confinement. At the bottom, in messy, childlike handwriting, someone had scrawled in pencil, "The doctor is making new rounds." I lost it. I ran back to my car and was about to tear out of there and never come back. But something stopped me. A thought that was so chilling it rooted me to the spot. What if he wasn't trying to scare me away? What if this was an invitation? What if he thought I was a new patient? Or a new doctor? I had to know. I don't know why. Maybe it was a death wish. Maybe it was the foolish bravery of a 22-year-old. But I had to see who, or what, was inside that building. Armed with my heavy flashlight and a tire iron from my trunk, I went to the first window I'd found open. I pried the board off completely and slipped inside. The air in the hospital was thick with the smell of dust, mold, and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet, like old blood. My flashlight cut through the oppressive darkness. I was in a long hallway. Doors lined both sides, most of them hanging open. I could see rusted bed frames, overturned cabinets, and the ghostly outlines of medical charts on the walls. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere deep inside the building. I moved slowly, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. I made my way towards a stairwell, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. As I passed one of the rooms, I glanced inside. My light fell upon a collection of objects arranged neatly on the floor. Dolls made from bundled rags and twine. Syringes yellowed with age, laid out in a perfect row, and in the center, a circle of human teeth. They were old brown and arranged in a gruesome, smiling pattern. I backed out of the room, my stomach churning. This wasn't just a squatter. This was a shrine, a den. This was Joseph's home. He had never left. I started heading for the stairs, deciding to get a look at the upper floors. The dragging sound had come from above. As I climbed, the air grew colder. On the second floor, I found what looked like a treatment room. A single leather-strapped chair sat in the middle of the room, facing a wall of cracked tiles. Wires dangled from the ceiling above it. On a small metal tray next to the chair was a set of clean, gleaming tools. Pliers, a scalpel, a bone saw. They weren't dusty or rusted. They were clean, cared for. That's when I heard it again. Scrape. Drag. It was coming from the floor above me. The third floor. My heart was a traitor, beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. I knew I should leave. I knew I should run and never look back. But I crept up the final flight of stairs. The third floor was the source of the cold. It was freezing up here. The hallway was different. It was clean. The floor had been swept. The dust was gone. At the far end of the hall, a single door was slightly ajar, a sliver of faint, flickering light spilling out from it. The dragging sound had stopped. It was utterly silent. I approached the door like I was walking a tightrope. My tire iron held up in a white-knuckled grip. I peered through the crack. The room was lit by dozens of candles, their flames dancing and casting long, monstrous shadows on the walls. It was a patient's room, but it had been transformed. The walls were covered in frantic scrawls, anatomical charts torn from old books, and pages from patient files, all layered over each other like grotesque wallpaper. In the center of the room was a metal frame bed. On the bed was a figure, covered by a white sheet. It was perfectly still, and standing next to the bed with his back to me was a man. He was tall and skeletally thin, wearing what looked like an old, stained janitor's uniform. He was bald with a pale, almost translucent scalp. He was humming softly, a discordant, tuneless melody. He was arranging medical tools on a tray, just like the one downstairs. I watched, paralyzed by terror, as he turned from the tray and reached for the sheet covering the figure on the bed. He pulled it back. It wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, one of those old CPR dummies. But it had been modified. It was covered in real human hair, crudely glued to its plastic scalp. Its painted-on eyes had been gouged out and replaced with large black buttons. Its smiling mouth had been stitched shut with thick, black thread. The man, Joseph, began to speak to it in a soft, gentle whisper. "Time for your checkup," he cooed, picking up a long, sharp needle from the tray. "You've been a very bad patient. Resisting treatment." He turned the mannequin's plastic head to face him, and that's when I saw its chest. Taped to the center of its torso was a photograph. A Polaroid. It was a grainy, overexposed picture of me, sleeping in my chair in the security trailer. It must have been taken through the window just nights before. A gasp escaped my lips. It was a tiny sound, but in that silent, candlelit room, it was like a gunshot. The man froze. His head snapped in my direction. He didn't turn his body, just his head, and it rotated almost 180 degrees like an owl's. His face, it was a mask of pale, stretched skin over a sharp skull. His eyes were wide, milky white, and completely devoid of pupils. And his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide, silent grin. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just stood there, staring right at me through the crack in the door, holding the needle. He took one slow, deliberate step towards me. The trance broke. I turned and ran. I didn't use the stairs. I half fell, half flew down them, my flashlight and tire iron clattering away into the darkness. I scrambled out the window I came in through, tearing my jacket and scraping my arms, and I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove out of there, tires screeching, and I never went back. I called Frank from a gas station 10 miles away, told him I quit, and hung up before he could respond. I never found out what happened. I assume the demolition crew eventually went in there and found his home. I don't know if they found him. I check the news for that town sometimes, looking for reports of a strange man found or a body discovered in the rubble. I've never seen a thing. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I think about that place. I think about Joseph, lost in the system for 30 years, creating his own little hospital in the ruins, with his own silent, smiling patient. And I think about that photograph, and I know that for a few terrifying nights, he had chosen a new one. My name is Arthur, and for the last 10 years of my working life, I took a job as a winter caretaker for a section of the Kaniksu National Forest. It sounded perfect. My wife had passed a few years prior, my kids were grown and had families of their own, and the city was just too loud. The job was simple solitude. I was to live in a small, sturdy cabin and watch over a depot of firefighting equipment, pumps, hoses, tools, that sort of thing. The nearest town was 50 miles away. From November to April, I was completely and utterly alone, and for the first 2 years, it was heaven. The silence of the forest in deep winter is something sacred. It's a silence so profound you can feel it in your teeth. The only sounds were the crackle of the wood stove, the groan of snow-laden branches, and my own heartbeat. My cabin was set in a large, natural clearing. On all sides, a dense wall of ancient Douglas firs and lodgepole pines stood like silent sentinels. I spent my days maintaining the generators, checking the inventory, and reading. I'd read more books in those first 2 winters than I had in the 30 years before. The third winter, things changed. It didn't start with a bang or a scare. It started with a feeling, a persistent, nagging feeling that I was being watched. I'd be sitting by the window, reading, and the hairs on my arms would stand up. I'd get this prickly sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you can feel someone's eyes on you in a crowded room. But there was no one, just me and the endless, snow-covered trees. I chalked it up to cabin fever. A man can't live in total isolation without his mind playing a few tricks on him. I started talking to myself more, creating routines to keep my brain occupied. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. It felt like it was coming from the trees themselves, specifically from the northern edge of the clearing, directly opposite my cabin's front window. I started watching the tree line. It became a strange, subconscious habit. I'd look up from my book and my eyes would just automatically go to that wall of green and white. And that's when I first noticed the anomaly. It was so subtle, I was sure I was imagining it. There was a particular cluster of 3 large firs, almost perfectly spaced. I'd used them as a landmark of sorts, a focal point in the monotonous landscape. One afternoon, I looked up at them and felt a sense of wrongness. The gap between the second and third tree seemed wider than I remembered. It was ridiculous. Trees don't move. I laughed at myself. Clearly, I needed to get more sleep. But the next day, the feeling was still there. I took a photograph of the tree line from my window with my old digital camera. I went about my day, did my chores, and that evening, I took another photo from the exact same spot. I uploaded both to my laptop and put them side by side. My blood went cold. It wasn't my imagination. The third tree, the one on the right, was a good 2 feet farther away from the middle one than it had been that morning. The change was almost imperceptible, unless you were looking for it, unless you were comparing the images directly. But it was undeniably there. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. This was impossible. It had to be a trick of the light, the angle of the sun, the way the snow had drifted. There were 100 rational explanations, but none of them felt right. My gut, the same gut that had served me well my entire life, was telling me that what I was seeing was real. The next day, I set up a more controlled experiment. I hammered a stake into the ground about 50 feet from the tree line, directly in line with the gap between the second and third trees. I used a roll of bright orange surveyor's tape and tied a piece to the stake and another to a low-hanging branch on the third tree, making a perfectly taut line. Now, if it moved, I would know for sure. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high anxiety, checking the orange line every 20 minutes. Nothing. It remained perfectly straight and tight. I started to feel foolish again. Maybe the change in the photograph was just a digital glitch. By the time darkness fell, I had almost convinced myself I was losing my mind. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. I kept dreaming of dark, shifting shapes just beyond the light of a campfire. The next morning, I woke up just before dawn. The first thing I did was look out the window towards my experiment. The orange tape was gone. I threw on my coat and boots and trudged out into the freezing air. The stake was still there, but the end of the tape I had tied to it was lying on the snow, cleanly cut. Not chewed, not torn. Cut, as if with a razor blade. I looked towards the tree line. The other piece of tape, the one I had tied to the branch, was also gone. The branch was bare, and the tree was now at least 10 feet to the right of where it had been yesterday. The gap was wide enough to drive a truck through. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my denial. This wasn't happening. I stumbled back to the cabin, my mind reeling. Trees don't move. They don't cut tape. I spent the entire day inside, the door locked, the curtains drawn, sitting in the dark with my wood stove for company. The feeling of being watched was no longer a subtle prickle. It was a suffocating pressure, an immense weight pressing in on the cabin from all sides. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. It was the silence of something holding its breath. That night, a blizzard rolled in. The wind howled like a banshee, and snow beat against the cabin in thick, wet sheets. I couldn't see more than 5 feet from my window. Sometime around midnight, over the roar of the storm, I heard a new sound, a low, deep humming. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the generator. It was a resonant, vibrational sound that seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating up through the floorboards and into my bones. It was a deeply unsettling, organic sound, like the purr of some impossibly large creature. The humming went on for hours. I sat in my chair, a heavy fireplace poker in my hands, just listening and watching the window, which was now just a black square. The humming finally stopped just as the first gray light of dawn began to seep into the sky. The blizzard had passed. The world outside was buried under a fresh, pristine blanket of snow. I forced myself to look out the window. My heart stopped. The tree line was no longer 100 yards away. It was right at the edge of my porch. Not one tree, not a cluster of trees. The entire northern wall of the forest had moved. It had crept forward in the night, under the cover of the storm, and was now looming over my cabin, the high branches blocking out the morning sun. I could see the individual needles on the boughs. I could smell the sharp, clean scent of pine. They were so close I could have reached out and touched them. I was trapped. The cabin was now just an extension of the forest itself. I checked the back door. The trees were there too. A dense, impassable wall of timber and snow. They had closed in on all sides, leaving only the small clearing for the cabin itself. I was inside a cage made of living wood. That's when I remembered the old caretaker's logs. The Forest Service kept decades of them stored in a metal footlocker under the bed. I had skimmed them before, but now I pulled them out, frantically searching for something, anything, that could explain this. I found it in a logbook from the winter of 1978. The caretaker's name was David. His early entries were normal, just like mine. But then, his handwriting started to get erratic, sloppy. He wrote about the feeling of being watched. He wrote about the trees. They change, he wrote. The patterns are wrong. I marked them. They move when you don't look. The big one by the creek, I call him George. George is closer today. A few pages later, the whispering started. Not a real sound. A sound in my head. They want me to join them, to be still, to be silent. His last entry, dated January 12, 1979, was just a single, scribbled sentence. The tree line doesn't move. I do. David was listed as having abandoned his post. His truck was still there when the spring crew arrived, but he was never found. I realized what he meant. The forest wasn't moving towards me. It was making me move towards it. Or rather, it was moving the very ground I stood on. The cabin, the clearing, everything was being slowly, inexorably drawn into the woods. The trees themselves were static. The land was the thing that was alive. For the next week, I lived in a state of pure terror. I rationed my food. I never let the fire go out. During the day, it was silent. The forest just watched. But every night, the humming would return. And every morning, I would wake up and find the cabin had been drawn deeper into the woods. The original clearing was now just a memory. I was surrounded by a suffocating density of trees. Sunlight barely reached the cabin floor. One morning, I noticed something new, scratches. Deep, vertical gouges in the logs of the cabin walls, as if a giant bear had been trying to claw its way in. But they weren't claw marks. They were the texture of bark. The trees were touching the cabin now, scraping against it as the earth carried me past them. My breaking point came on the 9th day. I woke up and the cabin was tilted at a severe angle. A large pine had pushed its way through the back wall, its thick branches shattering the window frame and reaching into the room like skeletal fingers. The air was filled with the overpowering smell of sap. The humming was no longer just a sound. It was a physical presence, a crushing force that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. I knew if I stayed another night, the cabin would be completely consumed, crushed, and I would be consumed with it. I had one last, desperate idea. The equipment depot. It housed several snowmobiles. If I could get to one, maybe I could outrun this thing, follow my own tracks back out to the access road. I bundled up, grabbed a flare gun and an axe from the emergency kit, and kicked open the front door. The world outside was a claustrophobic maze of tree trunks. I had to turn sideways to squeeze between them. I had no idea which way the depot was. The landscape was utterly alien. I fired a flare straight up. It burst above the canopy in a shower of red light, and for a few brief seconds, I saw it, the glint of the depot's metal roof, maybe 200 yards to what I prayed was west. I started moving, fighting my way through the dense undergrowth. Branches whipped at my face, and the snow was waist deep. It felt like the forest itself was actively trying to stop me, its limbs grabbing at my coat, its roots tripping my feet. I could feel the humming all around me, a silent, angry vibration in the air. I didn't dare look back. I just focused on the direction of the depot. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into the small clearing where the depot stood. Its corrugated metal walls were a beautiful, reassuring sight. I fumbled with the frozen lock, my fingers numb and clumsy. As I finally got the door open, I chanced to look back at my cabin, or where it should have been. It was gone. The forest had already closed the gap, leaving no trace it had ever been there. Just a solid, unbroken wall of trees. I got a snowmobile started on the third pull. The roar of its two-stroke engine was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, a defiant scream against the suffocating silence of the woods. I gunned the engine and took off, not following any trail, just heading in the direction I believed the road was, praying I was right. I drove for hours, a madman racing through a nightmare landscape. The forest never relented. It felt like it was shifting around me, the trees closing in on my path, trying to block me. Several times, I had to swerve violently to avoid a tree that hadn't been there a second before. I don't know how, but I made it. I hit the main logging road just as my fuel was running out and the sun was setting. I didn't stop. I abandoned the snowmobile and just ran. I ran for miles in the dark until I saw the headlights of a logging truck in the distance. The Forest Service didn't believe my story, of course. They said I'd had a psychotic break due to the isolation. They found the cabin eventually, or what was left of it. It had been crushed into splinters, buried under 100 tons of snow, and fallen timber miles from where it was supposed to be. They called it an avalanche, but I know what it was. The forest took it. I never went back to the woods again. I live in the city now, surrounded by concrete and noise. And even here, sometimes, when it's very quiet, I can feel that low, deep hum starting up in the foundations of my apartment building. And I look out my window at the small, decorative trees in the park across the street, and I swear they're closer than they were yesterday. My name is Chloe, and I used to work at the night desk at the Pinnacle, one of those new, ridiculously expensive residential towers downtown. It was the kind of place where the lobby looks like a modern art museum, and the monthly rent on a one-bedroom costs more than my car. My job was mostly just to be a presence from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., monitor the security cameras, and handle any late-night lockouts for the billionaire residents. It was the perfect college job, quiet, tons of downtime for studying, and great pay. The building had 50 floors, but when I started, only the first 30 were occupied. The upper floors, the penthouses and sub-penthouses, were still being finished. They were ghost floors, empty shells of drywall and exposed wiring. According to the building's digital directory and my own logs, no one, not residents, not contractors, not staff, was authorized to be above the 40th floor at night. The elevators were even programmed to deny access. It was a dead zone. For the first few months, the job was a dream. I'd buzz in the occasional food delivery, make small talk with a hedge fund manager walking his tiny, expensive dog, and then spend the next 7 hours highlighting textbooks. The silence of the vast, empty lobby was peaceful. The building felt secure, a high-tech fortress of glass and steel. The strange stuff began on a Wednesday night in early November. The internal phone at the front desk buzzed, a sound I rarely heard after midnight. I picked it up. Pinnacle front desk, Chloe speaking. For a few seconds, there was just static, a faint, hissing sound. I was about to hang up when a voice came through. It was a woman, and she was whispering. It was so faint I had to press the receiver hard against my ear. "Help me," she whispered. It was just those 2 words, drawn out and breathy, like she was running out of air. Then, a click, and the line went dead. I frowned, looking at the small LCD screen on the phone. It displayed the origin of the call. My stomach did a little flip. Suite 4404. Floor 44. An empty floor, a floor that shouldn't even have active phone lines. My first thought was that it had to be a technical glitch, a crossed wire from one of the active floors. I logged the incident, noting the strange caller ID, and tried to put it out of my mind. But the whisper, it sounded so real, so desperate. I spent the rest of the night feeling unsettled, my eyes constantly flicking to the bank of security monitors, half expecting to see something out of place. But the cameras showed nothing but silent, empty hallways and lobbies. The next night it happened again. Around 2 a.m., the phone buzzed. I hesitated before answering, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I picked it up. Front desk. Again the static. And then the same woman's voice, a little clearer this time, but filled with a terrifying ragged panic. "Please, he's coming back. Don't let him find me. 4404. Click." The line went dead. This was no glitch. Someone was in that suit and they were in trouble. I immediately pulled up the elevator logs on my computer. No one had gone to the 44th floor. The system showed no overrides, no unscheduled stops. I checked the stairwell access logs. Nothing. According to every high-tech system in this billion-dollar building, the 44th floor was, and had been, completely empty. I called my manager, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Albright. I woke her up, and she was not happy. I explained the calls, the suit number, the woman's voice. She was quiet for a moment before telling me, in a very firm tone, that it was impossible. The lines on those floors were disconnected. She said it was likely a prank from some of the building staff, or a ham radio enthusiast picking up stray signals. She told me to ignore it and that she would look into it in the morning. Her dismissal was so complete, so absolute, that it felt less like reassurance and more like a command. It made me feel cold. I couldn't just ignore it. What if someone was genuinely hurt? What if they'd gotten trapped up there somehow? Against my better judgment, and Mrs. Albright's direct order, I decided I had to go look. I had a master keycard with high-level access. I could override the elevator myself. I handed the desk over to the morning guy a few minutes early and took the staff elevator up. My heart pounded with every floor we passed. 38L39I40. The elevator dinged softly at 44 and the doors slid open. The air that hit me was different. It was cold, still, and smelled faintly of fresh paint and sawdust. The hallway was dark, lit only by the emergency lights near the floor. It was a concrete canyon, with gaping doorways where expensive apartment entrances would one day be. I found the space marked 4404. There was no door, just a raw opening in the drywall. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous, unfinished space. My phone's flashlight cut a nervous path through the darkness. The suite was huge, a skeleton of metal studs and hanging wires. Piles of construction materials were stacked against the walls. It was empty. Completely, utterly empty. I called out softly, "Hello, is anyone here?" Only the echo of my own voice answered me. I walked through the entire space, my light probing every dark corner. There was nothing. No sign of anyone. No hidden person, no prankster. I felt a wave of relief, but also profound confusion. I was about to leave when my light caught something on the floor near where the master bedroom would be. I knelt down. It was a single small, gold earring, the kind with a tiny diamond chip in it. It was lying in a thin layer of drywall dust. As I looked closer, I saw faint scuff marks in the dust around it, as if something or someone had been dragged across the concrete floor. My blood turned to ice, and then I smelled it. Beneath the smell of paint and dust, there was another sharper scent. Bleach. A strong chemical smell, like someone had tried to clean a stain. I backed out of the suite, my mind racing. The earring, the scuff marks, the smell of bleach, and the whispering voice. It wasn't a prank. Something had happened here. Someone had been here. When I got back to the lobby, I started digging. I used my high-level computer access to look beyond the simple logs. I wanted to know who owned this building. It was a shadowy corporation called Elysian Properties, and the sole owner, the man at the very top, was a reclusive, obscenely wealthy tech mogul named Alistair Finch. Finch was infamous. He was brilliant, eccentric, and known for his intense privacy. He owned a penthouse in every building his company built, and they were always the most secure, most private residences. His penthouse in the pinnacle was to be the entire 50th floor. I went deeper, searching news archives for anything on Finch or Elysian Properties, and I found it. A small article from a local paper 2 years back about a missing journalist. She had been working on an expose about Finch's questionable business practices. She had vanished without a trace. Her name was Sarah. The article included a picture of her. She was wearing a pair of small, gold earrings with diamond chips, identical to the one I was now holding in my shaking hand. I felt like I was going to be sick. This wasn't just a potential crime scene. This was connected to one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the city, and Mrs. Albright, her immediate, forceful denial made sense now. She wasn't just dismissing me. She was covering for him. The whole security infrastructure of the building wasn't just for the residents. It was for him, to ensure his secrets stayed secret. The phone calls weren't a live cry for help. I don't know what they were. A psychic echo, a residual haunting, some kind of technological glitch that replayed a final, desperate moment? I don't know. But I knew the voice was Sarah's, and I knew what had happened in Suite 4404. I sat at the desk for the rest of my shift, frozen. What could I do? Go to the police. With what? A single earring, a faint smell of bleach, and a story about a ghost on the phone. They would think I was crazy, and Alistair Finch would have the best lawyers money could buy. I was a 20-year-old college student. He was a god in this city. The next night, I came to work with a resignation letter in my bag. I was just going to finish my shift, drop the letter and the earring on the desk, and disappear. But when I got there, Mrs. Albright was waiting for me. It was the first time I'd ever seen her in the building at night. She was standing by the desk, her arms crossed, her face like a stone mask. "Chloe," she said, her voice flat and cold. "We need to talk." She led me into her office, a small, glass-walled room behind the front desk. She closed the door. "I got a report from the system this morning," she said, her eyes fixed on me. "An unauthorized elevator override to the 44th floor during your shift." I just stared at her, my mouth dry. "You were told to ignore the issue," she continued. "You were told it would be handled. Instead, you violated protocol and entered a restricted area." Why? I didn't know what to say. I couldn't tell her the truth. I just mumbled something about being concerned. She smiled, but it was a terrifying, mirthless expression. "Your concern is noted. It's also logged that you accessed sensitive files on our server. Files concerning Mr. Finch." Her smile vanished. "You've been a very curious girl, Chloe. We don't like curiosity here. It's a liability." The word, liability, hung in the air between us. In that moment, I knew I was in terrible danger. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was a problem that needed to be solved. "You're fired, of course," she said, standing up. "Your final paycheck will be mailed to you. You'll sign a non-disclosure agreement before you leave. It is legally binding in perpetuity." She slid a thick packet of papers across the desk. "Sign it, and you can walk out of here and forget any of this ever happened. Forget the calls, forget the 44th floor, forget Mr. Finch's name." Her message was crystal clear. Sign the papers and live. Don't, and what? End up like Sarah, a whisper in an empty room. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the pen. I signed my name, my signature a jagged, terrified scrawl. Mrs. Albright took the papers, a look of satisfaction on her face. "Good," she said. Now get your personal belongings and leave the premises. You are no longer welcome at the Pinnacle." As I walked out of the office, my legs feeling like jelly, I saw 2 new security guards standing in the lobby. They weren't wearing the usual building uniform. They were huge men in dark suits, the kind you see with politicians or mob bosses. They watched me as I gathered my backpack and my textbooks. They watched me as I walked across the vast, marble lobby. And they watched me as I pushed through the glass doors and fled into the safety of the night. I never went back. I dropped out of that college and moved to a different state 2 weeks later. I threw the earring into a river. I've never told anyone this story before. I know Alastair Finch is still out there, a celebrated genius opening new, luxurious buildings. And I know that somewhere in one of them, on a high, empty floor, there's a new suite being built. And maybe, late at night, when the city is asleep, the phone at the front desk will buzz, and a desperate voice will whisper for help that will never come. I was lucky. I got to walk away. But I will forever be haunted by the vacancy on the 44th floor, and the knowledge that some ghosts are not spirits, but the echoes of secrets that powerful men will kill to protect. My name is Frank. I'm 52 now, retired. But for 15 years I worked in night security for the city's transit authority. It wasn't a glamorous job. Most nights it was just dealing with drunks and kicking homeless guys off the last train. But for 1 year, I had a posting that was different. I was assigned to patrol the old, decommissioned Aldridge Line. The Aldridge Line was a relic. It was a deep, level subway tunnel built in the 1920s that was abandoned in the late 60s after a section of it collapsed during a construction project above ground. The official story was that the line was structurally unsound and too expensive to repair. They sealed both ends, cut the power, and basically wiped it off the map. My job was to make sure it stayed that way. The city was worried about urban explorers, graffiti artists, or squatters trying to get in and set up camp. The access point was a single, unmarked steel door in the wall of an active subway station. Behind it was a spiral staircase that went down, 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 probably 150 feet below ground. At the bottom was another heavy door, and then the Aldridge Line. My job was to go down there once a night, walk a 1-mile stretch of the tunnel to a specific ventilation shaft and back, and make sure no one had breached the perimeter. The first time I went down, it was genuinely awe-inspiring. It was like stepping into a time capsule. The air was cold, still, and smelled of damp earth and ozone. The only light was from my headlamp. The tracks were thick with decades of dust. Vintage advertisements from the 50s and 60s were still peeling from the curved walls. Ads for cigarettes, hair cream, and soda pop that hadn't existed for a generation. It was dead silent. So quiet you could hear the blood pumping in your ears. For months the job was routine. I'd go down, walk my mile, see nothing but dust and rats, and come back up. It was creepy, sure, but I'm not a man who spooks easily. I've seen a lot in my time. The tunnel was just a tunnel. But then came the night I found the doll. It was lying right in the middle of the tracks, about half a mile in. It was an old-fashioned porcelain doll, the kind with glassy eyes that open and close. It was dirty and its lace dress was tattered, but it wasn't covered in that thick, settled dust like everything else. It was clean. It had been placed there recently. I picked it up. Its eyes clicked open. I felt a shiver go down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Kids, I thought. Some explorers managed to find another way in. I scanned the walls with my light, looking for fresh graffiti or any other signs of entry. I found nothing. I took the doll with me, reported it, and my bosses just shrugged. "Keep an eye out," they said. A week later, I found something else. A small stack of stones, piled neatly on the third rail. It was almost like a little cairn, a marker. Again, no dust. I kicked it over and continued my patrol, a knot of unease tightening in my gut. These weren't just kids messing around. This felt different. It felt deliberate, ritualistic. The real shift happened about a month after that. I was deep in my patrol, approaching the turnaround point at the big ventilation shaft, when my headlamp caught something ahead. A flicker of movement. I stopped dead, turned my lamp off, and flattened myself against the cold, curved wall of the tunnel. I listened. At first, there was nothing. just the profound silence. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, and a whisper. It was too faint to make out the words, but it was unmistakably human. I stayed hidden, peering into the oppressive darkness. My eyes slowly adjusted, and I could just make out a faint, flickering light far down the tunnel, near the base of the vent shaft. It looked like candlelight. Protocol was clear: back out, call for backup. But I was a stubborn old fool. I had to know what was down there. I started moving forward slowly, quietly, using the maintenance alcoves along the wall for cover. As I got closer, the whispering became clearer. It wasn't one voice. It was several, whispering in a strange, rhythmic chant. I reached the last alcove before the vent shaft and peered around the edge. What I saw made my brain stall. At the base of the massive, circular shaft, where a sliver of moonlight filtered down from the street above, a small group of people were gathered. There were maybe a dozen of them, men, women, and even a few children. They were kneeling in a circle. In the center of the circle was a makeshift altar built from old railroad ties, and on the altar was the porcelain doll I had found. But it was the people themselves that were so horrifying. They were pale. Not just pale like they hadn't seen the sun. They were a chalky, fish belly white. Their hair was thin and colorless. They were all dressed in ragged, patched together clothing that looked like it had been scavenged over decades. But the worst part was their eyes. In the flickering candlelight, their eyes looked huge and dark, with no discernible pupils, like the eyes of a deep-sea creature. They were chanting, but the words were a strange, bastardized version of English, full of hissing sounds and guttural clicks. As I watched, one of them, a tall, gaunt man, stood up. He raised his hands and the chanting stopped. He began to speak, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. He spoke of the overworld, of the sun-scorched, of the great collapse that had saved their ancestors from the world of noise and fire. He was a priest, and this was his sermon. I realized with a dawning, sickening horror what I was looking at. These weren't squatters who had just moved in. They were a community, a tribe. They had been born down here. The collapse in the 60s. What if not everyone had gotten out? What if a handful of people had been trapped, presumed dead, and had survived, and had children, and their children had children? Generations living in total darkness, adapting, creating their own culture, their own religion, based on a catastrophic event. My foot slipped on a loose piece of gravel. It made a small, crunching sound. It was nothing, but in that silent chamber, it was a thunderclap. Every head in the circle snapped in my direction. A dozen pairs of huge, black eyes fixed on my hiding spot. The silence was absolute. The priest pointed a long, bony finger right at me. "Overworlder," he hissed. My blood ran cold. They poured out of the circle and came towards me. They didn't run. They moved with a silent, gliding speed that was deeply unnatural. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, my heavy boots pounding on the track ballast. I could hear them behind me, the soft, slapping sound of their bare feet on the concrete. They made no other sound. No shouting, no breathing. Just the relentless, terrifying sound of their pursuit. My headlamp beam bounced wildly, creating a dizzying strobe effect in the tunnel. I risked a glance over my shoulder. They were gaining on me. They were unnervingly fast and agile, flowing over the tracks and debris like water. The priest was in the lead, his pale face a mask of cold fury. I ran harder than I had in 30 years, my lungs burning, my heart feeling like it was going to explode. The mile back to the access staircase felt like a marathon. I could feel their presence behind me, a cold wave of menace. They were toying with me, I realized, hurting me. I finally saw it, the faint outline of the steel door at the base of the stairs. Hope surged through me. I put on a final burst of speed, fumbled with the handle, wrenched the heavy door open, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I heard a loud thud as one of them hit the other side. I scrambled up the spiral staircase, not stopping until I was back in the noise and bright, fluorescent light of the active station. I burst through the door into the station, gasping for air, looking like a wild man. A few late-night travelers stared at me. I didn't care. I leaned against the wall, my body trembling uncontrollably. I told my supervisor everything. He brought in the transit police. They organized a heavily armed team to go down and sweep the tunnel. I refused to go with them. They went down there for 6 hours. When they came back up, they said they had found nothing. The tunnel was empty. The altar was gone. The doll was gone. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there. They put me on administrative leave, sent me to a shrink. The official report said I'd experienced a stress-induced hallucination. They quietly reassigned me to a cushy job watching monitors at a bus depot until I retired. But I know what I saw. They weren't a hallucination. They were just smart. They knew how to disappear into the skin of the city. There are hundreds of miles of forgotten tunnels under our feet. Service corridors, sewer lines, abandoned pneumatic tubes, a whole world of darkness. And they had had generations to learn how to navigate it. Sometimes when I'm on the subway platform, waiting for a train, I look down at the tracks, into the dark maw of the tunnel ahead, and I think about them. The pale children of the Aldridge line. I wonder if they're still down there, whispering their strange prayers in the dark, hating the overworld, and waiting for the day the sun finally burns out. And sometimes, just for a second, I think I see a pair of wide, black eyes looking back at me from the darkness. And then the train comes, and it's gone. My name is Marcus, and I used to be a military policeman. After I got out, bouncing at bars and working event security got old fast. So when I saw a posting for a high-end security position at a place called Bioscience Dynamics, I jumped at it. The pay was incredible. The facility was a state-of-the-art corporate campus out in the middle of nowhere, all glass and brushed steel, surrounded by acres of manicured lawn and a very serious-looking fence. My job was night shift supervisor, running a team of 4 guards from a central control room that looked like something out of NASA. The place was a biogenetics and robotics research firm. What they actually did there was way above my pay grade. A lot of jargon about synthetic biology and next-gen neural interfaces. All I knew was that our job was to make sure nobody got in, and whatever was inside stayed inside. The security was intense. Keycards, biometric scanners, pressure plates, and over 500 high-definition cameras covering every inch of the place. It felt like the safest place on Earth. The heart of the campus was Building C. It was the R&D Nexus, a Level 4 biohazard containment facility. Even during the day, access was heavily restricted. At night, it was on total lockdown. My job was to watch the camera feeds from Building C and ensure everything remained static. For 6 months, it was the easiest money I ever made. I'd watch empty, sterile white hallways and labs on my monitors, do my rounds of the outer buildings, and drink coffee. The incident happened on a Thursday. It was a skeleton crew night, just me in the control room and 2 guards, Davis and Chen, on patrol. Around 1 a.m., I was doing a routine scan of the camera feeds in Building C. I was looking at camera C34, which monitored a long corridor in the sub-level 2 research wing, the deepest, most secure part of the facility. The hallway was empty. As always, I blinked, and when I looked back at the screen, there was a man standing in the middle of the hall. I physically jolted in my chair. It was impossible. There were 3 pressure-sensitive sealed doors between the elevator and that spot. No alarms had gone off. No alerts. He was just there. He was wearing the standard white bioscience researcher's clean suit, but his helmet was off. He was just standing there, facing away from the camera. Before I could even reach for the intercom, he collapsed. He just dropped to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. I immediately called Davis and Chen. "I've got a man down in C-Wing, sub-level 2, corridor Delta," I said, my voice tight. "No alarms triggered. I don't know how he got in there. Stay put. I'm calling the emergency line." I hit the red button on my console that patched me directly through to the director of security, a man named Pierce, at his home. I expected panic questions. Instead, his voice was unnervingly calm. "Sit tight, Marcus. Do not send your men in. Do not approach Building C. Just keep watching the monitors and report everything you see." Everything. The line went dead. It wasn't a request. It was an order from on high, and it sent a chill down my spine. I zoomed the camera in on the body. I couldn't see his face, but I could see a dark, wet stain spreading on the white floor beneath him. Blood. As I watched, something else happened that made my skin crawl. The body twitched. A violent, convulsive jerk. Then another. His limbs were flailing, but it wasn't the thrashing of a seizure. It was wrong, uncoordinated. His arm bent backwards at the elbow with a sickening, unnatural angle. I was about to vomit when I noticed something at the edge of the frame. A flicker of movement in the doorway of one of the labs, Lab C211. I swiveled the camera's POV. The lab door was ajar. It shouldn't have been. It was a magnetic, vacuum-sealed door that could only be opened from the inside or with a director-level keycard. There was no log of it being opened. I stared into the darkness of the lab, and then I saw it, just for a second. It was pale and thin, and it moved with a speed that defied physics. It wasn't a person. It was a blur of limbs, a chaotic scramble of motion that my brain couldn't properly process. It was there, and then it was gone, vanished back into the shadows of the lab. Pierce, what the hell is in that lab? I yelled into the dead phone line. The body in the hall twitched again, more violently this time. Then, with a soundless, fluid motion, it was dragged out of the camera's frame, leaving a wide, glistening smear of red on the white floor. It was pulled into the darkness of Lab C211. Suddenly, my entire console lit up with red alerts. Containment breach. All across sub-level 2. But that wasn't the scary part. A new icon flashed on my main screen, one I'd never seen before. It was a gold-colored padlock symbol with the words, C-SHA-RA-PRA-TOKEL-ENGGD. Every door in the entire facility, including the one to my control room, slammed shut with a heavy metallic clang. All external communication lines went dead. I was locked in. We were all locked in. Davis and Chen were screaming over the radio. They were trapped in the cafeteria of the administration building. I tried to reassure them, but my voice was shaking. Pierce knew. He knew whatever that thing was loose. And he hadn't warned us. He had locked us in with it. We weren't security. We were bait. I spent the next hour frantically trying to find a way to override the lockdown. Nothing worked. The Chimera protocol had wiped out my command access. I was just a spectator, a prisoner in my own control room. I started pulling up every camera feed from Building C, trying to get another look at the thing. I found it in the main robotics lab on sub-level 1. It was in the center of the room, hunched over something on the floor. It was humanoid in shape, but that's where the resemblance to anything human ended. It was hairless, with waxy, gray skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its limbs were too long, jointed in all the wrong places. It had 4 arms, 2 of which were long, scythe-like appendages of gleaming, chrome metal, seamlessly fused to its shoulders. The other 2 were thin, delicate things that ended in what looked like surgical tools. Its head was a smooth, oblong dome with no discernible face, just a single large, red optical sensor that glowed in the dark, sweeping the room like a lighthouse beam. It was a grotesque fusion of flesh and machine, a chimera. It was dissecting the body of the researcher with a horrifying, systematic precision, using its built-in tools. It was studying him. Then, its red eye swiveled and stared directly into the camera. It knew I was watching. It stopped what it was doing. It stood up to its full, terrifying height. It must have been 7 feet tall, and it tilted its featureless head. And then it moved. It blurred across the room and smashed the camera with one of its bladed arms. The feed went to static. One by one, the cameras in Building C started going dark. It was hunting them. It was smart. It knew the building's systems, and it was working its way up. Sub-level 2 was dark. Sub-level 1 was dark. Then the ground floor cameras started to go. It was coming for the surface. It was coming for us. Davis was panicking over the radio. "Marcus, what is that thing? What is happening?" "Stay calm," I said, my own voice betraying my terror. "It's in Building C. The doors are sealed. It can't get out of there." But as the words left my mouth, I was watching the feed from the main atrium of Building C. The thing was there, standing before the massive, reinforced steel doors that led out to the campus plaza. It raised one of its bladed arms. There was a high-pitched whine, and the metal began to glow cherry red where the blade touched it. It was cutting through the door like it was butter. "It's out," I whispered into the radio. "It's out of Building C." Chen started praying in Mandarin. Davis was just sobbing. I watched on the exterior cameras as it emerged into the moonlight. It stood for a moment, its red eyes scanning the campus. It looked at the administration building, where Davis and Chen were trapped. Then it looked directly at the command center. At me. And it started to move towards me, its strange, multi-jointed legs carrying it across the manicured lawn with an eerie, silent grace. I was a dead man. The control room was a glass box. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I backed away from the monitors, my hand resting on the butt of my sidearm, knowing how useless it would be. I watched the thing approach on the screens, a monster of science closing in on me. Then, something changed. It stopped about 50 yards from my building. It cocked its head, its red eye blinking, and it turned. It started moving towards the administration building instead, towards Davis and Chen. I realized what was happening. Pierce wasn't just observing. He was controlling the lockdown. He'd seen the thing coming for me, for his precious command center, and he had unlocked the doors to the administration building. He had sacrificed them to save the facility's control systems, to save me so I could keep watching, so I could keep reporting. He's opening the doors. I screamed into the radio, "Get out of there! He's letting it in!" I heard Davis scream, a short, choked-off sound. Then Chen, a terrified cry of, "No!" Then static. I watched on the monitors as the thing disappeared inside the admin building. The camera feeds inside were a chaotic nightmare of motion and static before they, too, went dark one by one. I sat there, in the silent control room, for what felt like a lifetime, just staring at the dead screens. I was alone. About an hour later, just as the sun was starting to rise, the Chimera protocol disengaged. The doors unlocked. The external lines came back on. Pierce called me. His voice was the same, eerily calm. "Report, Marcus." I couldn't speak. "Marcus," he said, his voice hardening. "Give me your report. What did you observe about the asset's behavior?" The asset. Not the monster. Not the creature. The asset. I finally found my voice. "You son of a bitch," I whispered. "You killed them. They were acceptable losses, Marcus." He replied without a hint of emotion. "Project Chimera is the future. Understanding its capabilities is paramount. Your observations are a vital part of that. Now, file your report. A cleanup crew is on its way." I didn't file a report. I took the hard drive from the central server, the one that recorded every camera feed, every communication, every second of that night. I walked out of the command center, got in my car, and drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove. I have the drive. It's my insurance policy. The reason they haven't come for me. But I know they're looking. I see them sometimes. Men in black sedans parked down the street from whatever motel I'm staying in. I never stay in one place for more than a few days. I don't sleep much anymore. When I do, I see it. The blur of limbs, the single red eye. I hear Davis screaming. I know that Bioscience is still out there, in their sterile building, working on the next asset. Pierce called it the future. If that thing is the future, I don't want to see tomorrow. I was a guard, hired to keep the monsters out. I never imagined the real monsters were the ones signing my paycheck.